Hello, everyone. Hi, Liam. I'm going to hide this slide in a second so that people can see the panelists, and then I will step back. There have been a lot of great discussions throughout this whole conference about the idea of potentially splitting out some scholarly article data as a way to improve performance, and what the implications would be for projects like Scholia that depend heavily on it, and how that relates to other projects like shared citations. So this is a panel to dive into some of those details and the work that Aisha has done to analyze the scope and potential impact of a split, and maybe tell us what a split would even mean. And so to begin with, maybe each of you, if you would just introduce in a couple of minutes your how you're currently thinking about the idea of a split, and what it means to you, and how you've been engaging with that question over the past year. And then we can get to some of the questions people have shared. Actually, first introduce yourselves, and then Aisha, I think it would be helpful as context for you to just talk through the analysis that you did to ground the conversation.
Okay, I think I can start the introduction. I am Aisha. I am currently in Bangladesh, and I am a data analyst for the search team at Wikimedia Foundation. I've been working on doing analysis on Wikidata and the queries that come through Wikidata query surveys to help inform decisions that will help ultimately scale the Wikidata query service. As part of our analysis, the biggest challenge we have so far is the size of Wikidata and the number of queries we're getting. So I guess we will discuss more about this today. Yeah, maybe Lydia, you can.
Yeah, thank you, Aisha. Hi, you probably know me. I'm Lydia. I do the product management for Wikidata, and I've been involved in WikiCite for quite a long time now, thinking about all the effects it has on Wikidata as a whole, and at the same time being super excited about what's possible with what we already have there, and all the new research and new understanding of our knowledge in Wikimedia and outside it allows.
Yeah, and I'm Daniel Mietjen. I like to play with the things that Lydia produces. So I have also been involved with WikiCite from the beginning. And when Wikidata was just like being launched, I was already giving talks to scientists. Look, it's bound to be big. It's not bound to be useful unless you engage. And it has taken almost a decade for the scientists to discover that it is actually a thing that could be useful. And now I'm very excited about the opportunities, but frustrated by the limitations, and interested in how we as a community can navigate that together.
Fantastic. So Aisha, you carried out an interesting analysis recently, some of which is still ongoing. Would you give us a little background to how that came about and what the results were?
Sure, thank you. So I started my analysis maybe around 6 months ago on Wikidata and the queries that come through Wikidata query service. The aim was to identify insights from Wikidata and the queries that will help us scale the service and kind of give us insight into what we can do for immediate disaster mitigation. So part of the plan was the size of Wikidata, which BlazeGraph probably cannot support very soon. Well, the word soon is quite ambiguous at this point because we really don't know how long it can go on. But so through my analysis, what I've been trying to do is figure out what Wikidata contains, how much of each of the things we have, and is there any way we can temporarily remove some data from it so that we can get some free space and keep continuing using Blaze Graph while we look for alternatives that can help us scale Wikidata. So my analysis started by looking into Wikidata subgraphs. And when I say subgraphs, I mean everything that is included inside of one instance of item. So since it's about scholarly articles, that's the example I'm going to start with. Everything that is item instance of scholarly article will be included in this scholarly article subgraph. And to define it a bit more concretely, everything, all the statements, direct statements and full statements that relate to such articles are considered part of the subgraph. But for example, not the authors themselves. The authors are instance of human, so we would consider them inside of the human subgraph. So that's the way we decided to define what a subgraph is. And there are a lot of connections among all the subgraphs in Wikidata. And by the nature of it, Wikidata is super interconnected. There are a lot of connections from scholarly articles to humans to various other fields. Now coming into the size of subgraphs, scholarly article was the most known already to be quite large, but not exactly how large or what is the difference of size with other subgraphs. Through my analysis, what I found was scholarly articles have contain 40% of all Wikidata items. And if we consider all the statements, direct, indirect, all the triples, that would, considering all the triples, scholarly articles would be 50% of Wikidata, which is a huge number. It's 6.5 billion triples out of 13 billion triples that entire Wikidata consists of. So that was the first thing that pops out because it's so large. The next largest subgraph is both humans and astronomical objects, which are both around 9% of Wikidata in terms of the number of triples. So this is where the idea of wanting to split scholarly articles in case of an emergency where Wikidata cannot run, it's kind of maxing out. That's where we want to be able to split it out temporarily and probably use some other method to support the queries that want information from scholarly articles, etc. So the other part of the analysis is for the queries. How many queries do we really really touch on this subgraph? So this analysis for scholarly articles specifically was around 2%, which is a very rough approximation. It could, I believe, since I did the analysis and looking into some of the example queries, it looks like it might be a smaller number. But then again, it's quite vague because sometimes we can give a very random query through Sparkle, such as item, predicate, object, everything is a variable. That is not really specific to scholarly articles, but it will bring all the scholarly articles in as well. So not looking into those very vague and very general Sparkle queries, I looked into all the queries that wanted some item from the scholarly article subgraph or some of the predicates that is mostly used in scholarly article subgraph, such as authors. If a user wanted all the items that have the author predicate, it's 99% of the time, most of them will be scholarly articles. So this is the way I kind of calculated how many queries there are that relate to this subgraph, and it was 2%. So the idea was that since it's a small number of queries, which is not a small number really, it's a small percentage, the number of queries is large because every day we get millions of queries through the Wikidata query service. So the idea was if it is a small number of queries, we can probably do some other sort of arrangements, maybe federation, maybe holding the data in some other format to help serve the data. But those are, everything is still part of the discussion. There is no decision made yet. The analysis is still going on for other subgraphs. I think there's also already a link to my analysis on scholarly articles. From there, you can go ahead and look into other subgraphs as well. Since those are small, the analysis looks quite different because those are very small compared to scholarly articles. But yeah, that's that's quite a large context I gave, and maybe everyone else can start chiming in. Thank you.
Thank you, Aisha. People shared a fair number of questions in advance, starting with what's driving the growth of citations? Daniel, you covered the recent
essentially site. James here, a bot supported by the Internet Archive. So that's a one-person initiative so far, or a small team initiative, not sustainable. And so, yeah, but that's the answer to the question.
And what drives growth in use as well? A number of people have commented that the queries they care about currently time out, so they're not able to use it for things they'd like to use it for, and that some of the queries they care about they can test now, but they would really be interesting if there were a more complete graph. Are there major Scholia use cases that you expect would grow significantly if the graph reached some threshold?
I'd like to answer what you started with by saying the timeout of queries. Part of the reason some of the queries timeout is because the returning result is so large, or the result that the service has to go through is so large. For example, if I just want to look into how many scholarly articles are there, by just grabbing all the subject, predicate, object, every triple, it will time out. Although it's a very simple query and it works for any other subgraph. So yeah, part of the reason is because the data is really huge that the service has to return.
I think, well, I like the analysis that Aisha has done very much, and I think we should do more of this in a more general sense, not just for scholarly articles, but in general to understand the system better. I would personally like to know more about who's using Scholia, because we just, at the Scholia end, we just get some sort of a rough daily count. We don't know which queries are being used and so on, which makes it difficult to really think in terms of use cases very much. So what we get is indirect. On the other hand, it would be very easy for Scholia to increase the number of queries that go to the query service, and we have consciously not done this. So, for instance, we do not expose the HTML that we generate to search engines at the moment. But if we were to do that, that could easily change that number from 2% to something higher, which would then just complicate the problems, which is why we haven't done it. On the other hand, I find the argument that like it's just 2% of the queries or so also problematic. Just imagine Wikipedia. How many percent of the clicks on any given Wikipedia page go to references? It's a small percentage as well. I've actually done some research into this. We have some data for this. It is a small percentage. Does that mean we should get rid of all the references? No. And so I think that argument alone is not an argument for me. But it's a valid data point, an interesting data point. And so now I want to see more of the arguments, also technical solutions. I would like to mention that 2 or 3 years ago, we started a page on the limits of Wikidata, where we tried to essentially ask the same questions, but as outsiders, it was very hard to gather that material, or even sometimes to ask the right questions or frame it properly. And so that thing never actually went anywhere, but we've tried, and we've used the insights that we've gained in the process so that Scholia wouldn't drain the system. And also, like any Scholia-related curation activity has actually focused on interlinking the stuff that is there, rather than scaling up any imports or so. Then that, of course, also makes it difficult to cut anything off. And then we have a number of open-ended questions, like the topic of an article or of any work, and that can essentially point to anywhere in the graph. And so that, again, would make it difficult. But I don't think Scholia should be the only use case here. Of course, it is like kind of pioneering the problem cases in some way. And that is also, to some extent, I think, useful for the ecosystem. And so from an ecosystem perspective, we should think about how we can, let's say, feel the pain before it becomes overwhelming. That's something that the Scholia team is very interested in doing, although that's not the main reason why we do Scholia. We can do well without feeling the pain. Yeah, maybe that's enough for the moment. I'll let the others speak a bit more.
And maybe I can add a bit to the 2%. I think 2% is actually pretty cool in the sense that it's 2% of our queries. That is a lot. Problem for me is more on the 50% side, right? We right now have about 12,000 active editors, so people who make 5 or more edits per day. And I don't think we have anywhere near 6,000 of them that care about these 50% of Wikidata. And I really appreciate that all the people here have done a ton of work to get more people involved in this and so on. But this is the piece that makes me much more worried for the overall health of Wikidata than the 2%.
So what would it mean to split out a subgraph? And maybe we can come back to the question of what the implications would be for those 2% and the people who care about it. But I think there's a lot of general uncertainty. And since in Mike's session during the opening keynotes, he said that, you know, in a catastrophic scenario, people might just remove this category of data from BlazeGraph. That feels like something that we should make sure doesn't happen.
And we're working towards not making that happen, right? That's very much not what we want to do. But at the same time, we are at the point where we just have a very hard time judging how far we are from the ultimate limits of BlazeGraph, because we are pushing it more than anyone else has ever pushed it. So we're in unknown territory, right? And I think it's prudent to be transparent about this and have a plan for what we do instead of running around like headless chicken when worst comes to worst. That's basically it, right? So, and in this case, one of the things we want is to be able to say, okay, we can restore some service or some part of the service for everyone. How do we make that happen as quickly as possible for the part that most people need immediately? So we have then some time to figure out how to, or to buy us some time to find the proper solution. Now, it's not like we're sitting around and not finding a proper solution, but it's not an easy thing, right? Just recently, there was a scientific paper published with an overview of about, I think it was 125 different graph stores and RDF stores. We have to look at all of those and figure out if any of them meets our need, and then if any of them is even close, figure out how we're gonna adapt that to what we have. Because we have a number of adaptations to BlazeGraph right now that people use, like the label service that is used to actually show you labels in your query results. just for
but,
some context setting.
Yes, that's very helpful. But so to avoid not having access to the data in the case that it needed to be removed from the primary Wikidata graph, what could splitting out a subgraph mean? What could it look like?
Right. So I think we need to differentiate removing something short-term from BlazeGraph while still keeping it in Wikidata, because those are two independent systems.
Right.
Wikidata.org is the main store of that data, and then we replicate it into BlazeGraph and through the Wikidata query service. And talking about the latter for the short term. For the long term, that's a discussion we're having with people around WikiCite, all of you. Does it make sense to keep this large amount of scientific papers in Wikidata, or are they better served somewhere else? And that is basically the underlying question.
I see. But since there's still uncertainty about whether it would be necessary to temporarily remove access and how long the access would be removed, if we go back to the four options that people discussed back in Cape Town for a future WikiCite project, and yes, Liam, this is confusing because everyone means something different by WikiCite, but that could be a separate shared citations project, for instance. This seems like it strongly weighs. It puts its finger on the scale and says there might be a good reason to start pursuing one of the projects that sets up a separate Wikibase or a separate database now, so that if for whatever reason this was no longer accessible through the query service, it would be accessible through whatever other mechanism we would already be working on. Does that match what you're thinking? How does thinking about the current scaling challenges influence your thoughts on how we choose where to go?
Well, maybe I can just drop some thoughts here. It's not a direct response to your question, but it responds to the things that were said just before. So one, I actually appreciate very much that we're doing this disaster exercise. So as you may know, I'm active in disaster contexts where we leverage Wikidata to help with disaster response and mitigation and preparation. That's very important. And so I think that's interesting, useful, necessary, all these things together. And if in the process, then we have to entertain scenarios where certain aspects of the ecosystem just experience catastrophic failure. Well, yeah, that's the point of those exercises. Second, I think we could also think about making it easier to query dumps. For many use cases, we do not actually need real-time things. Like for Scholia, I think a daily update would be nice. Weekly would be acceptable. Monthly is where we would get into a problem range. But we don't need it every 5 minutes or so, unless we are actively curating the data, which is what we want to facilitate. But that happens at a lower scale. And so maybe we can think about making it easier for people to actually query the dumps, which right now is not easy. So there's a data toolkit, there is a number of other toolkits, but they don't work for the normal user, and also they're not easily Scholia-fiable, basically, in the sense that you can put a front end in front of them, because they are themselves already front ends. Yeah, and maybe I'll stop at this point here.
You raise a good point, right? Having the ability to, for example, query the dumps, that is definitely one thing I think, especially for Scholia, we can entertain, right? Because it has specific query structures. We know what kind of queries it will produce, and maybe there are better ways to have that particular data in a way that is easily accessible for Scholia without having to run the whole BlazeGraph shebang with all of Wikidata around it. is of course not a solution for everything, but that is definitely something to explore, I would say.
So we have a following session in 5 minutes or so for general open discussion, and we'll keep talking about some of these issues. Two clarifying questions for this audience, for these fabulous panelists. One is, Lydia, you were describing short versus medium-term intent for the disaster planning. Does that mean that if temporarily the scholarly metadata was removed from BlazeGraph while figuring out how to migrate away from BlazeGraph, then as soon as the migration was done, the full Wikidata database would be brought back?
I mean, that would definitely be my wish. How the future looks and what especially will be possible or not possible with whatever we will be able to migrate to, I really can't say, right? It is still very much up in the air, and we would appreciate help from people with testing out other graph backends and similar things, as we've said in the talk.
So it feels to me that if it's possible that as a result of doing the disaster planning and then some migration, there's still some longer time when even after the migration, all the scholarly metadata isn't brought back in because there are still some concerns, then maybe as part of that planning, we might also want to answer the question, how could separate subgraphs be administered, edited, shared, queried?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is there a place where that analysis is happening now? Is this something that needs more community feedback? Is it something where we can start catalyzing discussions?
I would say so, yes, very much. And if any type of data or input from the development team or anything similar is helpful for those discussions, please let me and Aisha know. We're happy to help with that, of course. But yeah, I think it ultimately is a decision that the WikiCite community needs to take, right? How does it want to position itself and where and what exactly does it want to take care of? What kind of data corpus and where does that end or not end?
If the community really wants this data to be in Wikidata, then we need to agitate for that and help figure out how to make that work. And if we decide we want it to be in a separate wiki base, then maybe this is a convenient time to test that out and experiment with what's the federated Spark queries and other things look like now.
Yes,
very much.
Thank you all so much.
I would say, if they want it to be in Wikidata, we have to ask, what are they really asking for? If they want to be able to use the same query endpoint to get a mixed graph of Wikidata and other things as well, you can do that without having the same wiki base. If they want to have a melded user experience where they're editing Wikidata and scholarly articles on the same interface, they don't have to be the same wiki. Like, we can achieve a lot of the same ends and obscure those details to the user, because the way I see it, we're going to have a ton of these databases with billions of entities, and they'll be interconnected with one another, and we have the possibility of just having one interface. And so I think when we talk about, do we want it in Wikidata, do we want it somewhere else, I think we should kind of break it apart into more questions, more stories. And also, just as far as a specific wiki base goes, the Wikipedia Citations database that I presented about earlier, one of the long-term visions is that it could be just a general repository for published works in general. And so I think because it is sort of being intentionally built for this kind of thing, it is very open for the kind of experimentation that Wikidata may be averse to. And the point isn't to jettison content from Wikidata or to compete with Wikidata or anything. We just have our own motivations, and we are happy to support additional use cases as well.